Sarah sat quietly at her desk, the harsh glow of the fluorescent lights above casting an unforgiving light on her computer screen. It was nearly 6 p.m., but the office was still buzzing with the familiar sounds of clattering keyboards and muted conversations. As she stared at the blinking cursor on her screen, her mind drifted far from the presentation she was supposed to be working on. Instead, her thoughts were consumed by a recurring sense of dread, one that had followed her home after every workday for the past several months. She was exhausted, but not just physically. It was the emotional toll of dealing with toxic people in her life that had left her feeling drained and powerless. Her supervisor, a condescending and manipulative man, seemed to find pleasure in belittling her work. Her colleague, Jessica, was the queen of passive-aggressive comments, always dropping hints about how much harder she worked or how Sarah's efforts were never quite enough. And then there was her old friend, Laura, who had become a master of guilt trips and emotional blackmail, constantly needing Sarah's help but never returning the favor. It wasn't always this way. Sarah had always been empathetic, willing to listen, help, and be there for others. But somewhere along the line, she had become a target for those who thrived on negativity, manipulation, and control. She'd let their criticism seep into her self-worth, their needs override her boundaries. Each day felt like a new battle against an invisible force, one that left her feeling smaller and more exhausted with each passing moment. Something had to change. Sarah could no longer ignore how these toxic relationships were affecting her. They were bleeding into every aspect of her life, her work, her friendships, even her health. She wasn't sleeping well, constantly replaying conversations in her head, wondering what she could have said or done differently. Her anxiety was at an all-time high, and she felt trapped in a cycle of negativity that she couldn't break free from. One evening, after another particularly draining day at work, Sarah found herself scrolling mindlessly through her phone when she stumbled upon an article about Stoicism, an ancient philosophy that focused on inner peace, resilience, and emotional control. Something about it clicked with her immediately. The idea that true strength came not from conquering others, but from mastering your own emotions, resonated deeply with her. She had spent so long trying to manage the toxic people in her life, trying to navigate their moods and manipulate their reactions. But what if instead she could manage her own? That night, she made a decision. For 1 week, she would commit to practicing a set of habits and principles inspired by Stoicism and modern psychology. Her goal was simple: to regain control over her emotional well-being, set firm boundaries, and stop letting toxic people dictate her sense of self-worth. It wouldn't be easy, but Sarah was ready to reclaim her peace. Habit 1: Identifying toxic patterns. The next morning, Sarah woke up with a sense of determination she hadn't felt in months. She began her journey by focusing on the first habit: identifying toxic patterns. If she wanted to protect herself from being emotionally manipulated, she needed to recognize the behaviors that were causing her so much distress. She sat down with a notebook and began listing the characteristics she had read about the night before: manipulation, constant criticism, guilt trips, and negativity. As she wrote, memories of past interactions flooded her mind. She thought about how her boss would subtly undermine her confidence with backhanded compliments, how Jessica's relentless need to compete made her feel inadequate, and how Laura's emotional demands left her feeling guilty for even wanting a little space. Seeing these toxic patterns laid out in front of her was overwhelming. It was like pulling back a curtain to reveal a mess she had been trying to ignore for too long. How had she allowed these behaviors to become such a normal part of her life? She realized that for years, she had been absorbing the negativity of others without even recognizing it. But awareness was the first step. Sarah knew that to protect herself, she had to be vigilant. Toxic people thrived on subtle manipulation, little comments, passive-aggressive gestures, guilt-inducing requests, and she had to learn to spot them before they could take hold of her emotions. The challenge, though, was that this awareness brought a heavy burden. As the day progressed, Sarah became hyper-aware of every toxic interaction around her. At work, she noticed the way her supervisor constantly shifted blame onto her team, never taking responsibility. She realized how Jessica would drop little barbs into conversations, always making herself seem superior. Even when Laura texted her asking for yet another favor, Sarah saw it for what it was, yet another guilt trip designed to make her feel obligated. It was exhausting. The more she saw, the more Sarah felt weighed down by the realization of just how many toxic influences she had allowed into her life. But despite the emotional toll, she reminded herself that this was necessary. Without recognizing the problem, she couldn't hope to fix it. Habit 2. Setting boundaries. By midweek, Sarah had identified the toxic patterns in her life. The next habit she focused on was setting boundaries, something that felt both empowering and terrifying at the same time. Sarah had never been good at setting boundaries. She worried too much about what people would think of her, about being seen as rude or selfish. But she knew that without clear limits, the toxic people in her life would continue to drain her energy and take advantage of her kindness. Her first test came at work. Her supervisor, once again, had called a meeting late in the day, piling extra tasks on her desk, as if she had endless time. Normally, Sarah would have smiled, nodded, and stayed late to get everything done, despite feeling overworked and unappreciated. But not this time. She took a deep breath and said, "I understand these tasks are important, but I won't be able to stay late tonight. I can have them done by tomorrow afternoon." Her heart raced as the words left her mouth. Her supervisor raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback. But instead of arguing, he simply nodded and moved on to the next topic. Sarah felt a surge of relief. Setting that boundary hadn't been as catastrophic as she had feared. But the real challenge came when she had to confront her friend Laura. Laura had always relied on Sarah for emotional support, calling at all hours of the night, expecting Sarah to drop everything for her. While Sarah valued their friendship, she had come to realize how one-sided it had become. When Laura called her that evening, complaining about a minor problem and hinting that she needed Sarah's help once again, Sarah took a deep breath. She remembered the importance of being direct but kind. "Laura, I care about you and I want to support you, but I'm feeling really drained right now. I need some time for myself tonight." The silence on the other end of the phone felt deafening. Sarah's stomach churned with guilt. But after a few moments, Laura responded with a curt, "Fine. I'll talk to you later," and hung up. It wasn't the response Sarah had hoped for, but she knew she had done the right thing. Establishing boundaries was harder than she had anticipated. It wasn't just about saying no. It was about standing firm, even when people pushed back or made her feel guilty. And that guilt was the hardest part. Every time she set a boundary, she felt a pang of selfishness, as if she were abandoning the people she cared about. But she reminded herself that self-care wasn't selfish. Protecting her emotional well-being was essential if she wanted to be truly present for the people who mattered. Habit 3. Practicing emotional detachment. The final habit Sarah worked on during the week was practicing emotional detachment. She had read about the gray rock method, where the goal was to remain emotionally neutral and unresponsive in the face of toxicity. This would be her shield against people who tried to manipulate her emotions or draw her into their drama. Jessica provided the perfect opportunity to put this into practice. At lunch, Jessica began one of her usual passive-aggressive tirades, this time commenting on Sarah's recent project. "I'm surprised they let you handle that alone," Jessica said with a smirk. "I mean, it's such a big responsibility. I'd be so nervous." But deep down, Alex knew that change was never supposed to be easy. Stoicism wasn't about instant transformation. It was about consistent practice, about showing up each day, even when it felt hard. Marcus Aurelius had written, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Alex clung to this quote during the difficult moments, reminding themselves that true strength came not from avoiding difficulty, but from enduring it. By the end of the first week, Alex had begun to feel the faintest glimmer of change. The mornings were still hard, the routine still challenging, but something was shifting internally. There was a growing sense of resilience, a small but significant feeling of control over how the day began. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, and for the first time in a long while, Alex felt like they were on the right path. Day 4. Building momentum. As Alex moved into the second half of the week, something significant began to change. What had started as a series of mechanical actions, waking up early, meditating, and practicing gratitude, was slowly evolving into a routine that brought with it a sense of calm and focus. On the fourth day, Alex found themselves getting out of bed without the internal struggle. It wasn't effortless, but there was a shift, a quiet acceptance that this was the new normal. The resistance that had once felt so overwhelming was fading, replaced by a growing sense of discipline. The most striking change, however, wasn't the ease with which they now rose each morning, but the way Alex was beginning to experience the rest of the day. There was less anxiety, less frustration. Even when things went wrong at work, when a project got delayed or a meeting didn't go as planned, Alex noticed that their reactions were different. Instead of spiraling into stress, they found themselves pausing, taking a breath, and recalling the Stoic principle that had been guiding them. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. This realization was a turning point. Alex began to understand that the value of the morning routine wasn't just in those first few hours of the day. It was in how it set the tone for everything that followed. By focusing on what they could control, how they reacted, how they prepared, Alex was beginning to find a sense of peace amidst the chaos. Habit 4. Journaling and evening reflection. With newfound confidence, Alex decided to add another Stoic practice to their routine: journaling. Inspired by Marcus Aurelius's meditations, Alex began taking time each evening to reflect on the day. This wasn't just about recounting events. It was about examining their reactions and emotions with honesty and objectivity. It wasn't just that she had avoided conflict. It was that she had reclaimed control over her emotions in a moment where she would have typically felt powerless. Her supervisor's words still lingered, but they didn't sting as deeply as they used to. She realized that his negativity had more to do with his own insecurities and frustrations than with her actual performance. By practicing non-reaction, Sarah had not only deflected his negativity, but had also preserved her emotional energy. She felt lighter, more in control. The realization hit her hard. She didn't need to participate in every argument or emotional confrontation that others tried to draw her into. She could choose to step back, observe, and respond calmly. And that was where her real power lay. Habit 5. Cognitive reframing. Sarah's next breakthrough came when she began to fully embrace cognitive reframing, a habit that would drastically change how she viewed the toxic people in her life. Cognitive reframing was about changing her perspective, learning to view toxic behavior not as a personal attack, but as a reflection of the other person's inner turmoil. At work, her colleague Jessica continued her passive-aggressive comments. "Oh, Sarah, I saw that you were assigned the big presentation next week. That must be stressful, huh? Hope it's not too much for you." Normally, Jessica's words would cut Sarah, leaving her feeling inadequate and insecure. But this time, Sarah paused and reframed the situation in her mind. Instead of seeing Jessica's comment as a personal insult, she saw it for what it truly was, a reflection of Jessica's own insecurity. Jessica felt the need to tear others down to feel better about herself. It wasn't about Sarah's abilities or worth. It was about Jessica's need for validation. "Thanks for the concern, Jessica," Sarah responded, her voice calm. "I'm looking forward to the challenge." Jessica blinked, caught off guard by Sarah's confident response. The satisfaction of landing a blow on Sarah didn't come this time, and Jessica quickly moved on, her power over Sarah slipping away. Later that day, Sarah found herself smiling. She had finally managed to step out of the emotional web that had entangled her for so long. By reframing Jessica's words, she had robbed them of their power. Sarah began applying this habit everywhere, in conversations with her boss, with her friends, and even with family members who tended to undermine her decisions. It wasn't about ignoring people's words, but understanding that their negativity often had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with their own internal struggles. This shift in perspective was liberating. Toxic people no longer had the same grip on her emotions. Instead of feeling hurt or defensive, Sarah began to feel compassion. Not pity, but an understanding that these individuals were trapped in their own cycles of negativity. While she couldn't change them, she could change how she responded to them. Habit 6. Limiting exposure. By this point in her journey, Sarah was beginning to see the profound impact of the Stoic principles she had adopted. But she knew there was one more step she had to take if she wanted to truly reclaim her peace. She had to start limiting her exposure to toxic people. Sarah had always been the kind of person who felt obligated to maintain relationships, no matter how draining they were. Whether it was a family member, a longtime friend, or a colleague, she believed that cutting ties or pulling back meant failure. But as she grew stronger in her emotional boundaries, Sarah realized that protecting her mental well-being meant being selective about who she allowed into her life. Her first test came when her friend Laura called again. This time, Laura was in full crisis mode, complaining about work, about her relationship, and subtly hinting that she needed Sarah's help once again. Sarah had always been Laura's emotional dumping ground, the one who picked up the pieces when everything fell apart. But this time was different. Sarah had started to see the pattern, the constant negativity, the emotional manipulation, the way Laura's problems always became Sarah's responsibility. "I'm sorry, Laura," Sarah said gently. "I can't take this on right now. I've got a lot going on myself." The silence that followed was deafening, but Sarah didn't fill it with apologies or excuses. She had made her decision. Laura sighed heavily, clearly frustrated, but Sarah stayed firm. "I hope things get better for you," Sarah added, "but I need to focus on my own mental health right now." The conversation ended shortly after, and for the first time in years, Sarah didn't feel guilty. She didn't feel like she was abandoning Laura. Instead, she felt empowered, because she had chosen to protect her emotional space. Sarah began applying this habit in other areas of her life as well. She stopped attending after-work drinks with her toxic colleagues, choosing instead to spend time with positive influences, whether that was grabbing coffee with a supportive friend or spending time in nature to recharge. She learned that she didn't have to expose herself to negativity out of obligation. By limiting her exposure, she created more room for joy, peace, and positivity in her life. Habit 7. Building a support system. As the week drew to a close, Sarah realized that the final habit she needed to adopt was perhaps the most important of all. Building a support system. It wasn't enough to limit toxic people. She needed to surround herself with those who uplifted and encouraged her. Sarah reached out to an old friend, Claire, someone who had always been a positive influence in her life, but whom she had drifted away from due to her busy schedule. They met for coffee, and within minutes, Sarah felt a warmth and lightness that she hadn't experienced in months. Claire was kind, supportive, and genuinely interested in Sarah's well-being. She offered advice when needed, but, more importantly, she listened without judgment. The contrast between her time with Claire and her interactions with people like Jessica or Laura was striking. After her coffee with Claire, Sarah felt energized, hopeful, and optimistic. She realized how important it was to nurture relationships with people who inspired her to grow, rather than those who drained her. Sarah also joined a book club she had been hesitant to commit to before. It was a small group, but they shared her love for literature and often discussed life's deeper questions. For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt connected to a community of like-minded individuals, people who encouraged her to be the best version of herself. Through this experience, Sarah understood that building a support system was essential for her mental and emotional health. Toxic people would always exist, but by surrounding herself with positivity and kindness, she could buffer herself from the negativity. As the week came to an end, Sarah took a moment to reflect on the journey she had been on. What had started as an experiment to reclaim her emotional well-being had turned into something much deeper. She had not only learned how to deal with toxic people, but had also transformed her relationship with herself. By adopting these Stoic-inspired habits, Sarah had found her way back to a place of inner peace, a place where the actions of others no longer dictated her self-worth. Toxic people, once a source of constant anxiety, had lost their grip on her emotions. She had learned to set boundaries, detach from negativity, and protect her mental space, all while building a support system that nurtured her growth. The most profound lesson Sarah had learned was that she didn't need to change the toxic people in her life. She had spent years trying to manage their behavior, hoping they would one day treat her with the respect and kindness she deserved. But Stoicism had taught her that the only thing she could control was herself, her reactions, her boundaries, and her choices. Sarah smiled as she closed her journal. This wasn't the end of her journey, but the beginning of a new chapter. She would continue to face challenges, and there would be moments when toxic people would test her limits. But now, armed with the habits she had practiced, Sarah felt ready. She had the tools to navigate even the most difficult interactions with grace, compassion, and resilience. As she reflected on the week, Sarah realized that these habits weren't just about dealing with toxic people. They were about living a life grounded in peace and strength. It was about cultivating a sense of inner calm that no one else could take away. Sarah's journey served as a reminder to anyone reading. You can't always control the people in your life, but you can control how you respond to them. By setting boundaries, practicing emotional detachment, and building a strong support system, you can protect your emotional well-being and create space for the things that truly matter. Call to action. If you've been struggling with toxic people in your life, take the first step today. Start by identifying the patterns, setting boundaries, and reclaiming your emotional space. Remember, your peace is worth fighting for. With a deep breath, Sarah turned off her computer and stepped outside, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. For the first time in a long time, she felt truly free.